idea, probably we should have put the question mark at the end of failed reconciliation. And what we're going to do is the following. We want to have a sort of a closed dialogue at the beginning, like a 30 minutes of a conversation between Roddy and myself. And then after that, we are going to open to a public dialogue with you. The invitation is that, please, if you have any questions, we would like you to try to keep them with you, not to write them in the chat until we open up the floor for Q&As, because it could be that some of the questions that you have get answered along the way, but also because we really want to invite you to participate in a dialogue, meaning that you speak to our speaker and that we can listen to each other. So we will do this open dialogue for about 40 minutes. And then the idea would be towards the end to do a 5-minute final remarks on my behalf. So with that in mind, Roddy, very, very welcome. Fantastic to have you here. Why don't you kick us off with a sort of nice summary, you know, the key takeaway points and all your argument about failed reconciliation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to Gwen, to Rodemos, and of course to Andre and the Centre for Religion, Reconciliation and Peace at Winchester. This is brilliant. Thank you so much. What a great opportunity to be with my old friend Andre and to be able to have this dialogue. We've kind of had very sort of parallel careers, and I think we're kind of very often looking at the same thing at the same time. So it's really exciting to be here. Yeah, failed and failing reconciliation. So it's something I've been working on with brilliant colleagues at Louvain. We have a special edition coming out in Peace Building this year that kind of tries to understand what failed and failing reconciliation means. It's also, as Andre said, it's based upon what I'm going to talk about today, is also drawing upon some of the kind of conceptual insights for my monograph that will come out on the Colombian peace process, but at the end of this year. Of course, the point with failed, if we were to call it failed reconciliation, then in a sense that implies closure, right, and an end. And I think from my perspective, reconciliation doesn't necessarily have a definitive end, but we would hope is something that moves forwards and moves backwards and so on and so forth. Anyway, we can come to that in the Q&A. So I'm going to talk for about 18 minutes. I timed myself, so hopefully that will be okay. So until fairly recently, I was pretty reticent to talk about and to use the term reconciliation. I think from my perspective, having come from living for many years in Latin America and being directly involved in accountability processes and initiatives against, as Andre said, Rios Montt, for example, in the genocide case of Guatemala, it felt to me that the term was often kind of too habitually employed by states in what were effectively pernicious efforts to move away from, or in a sense not to go anywhere, from their dark and violent past and in a sense prevent accountability, right? So in short, for me, the term was very often synonymous with impunity and seemed to place overwhelming responsibility upon survivors and victims to forget the past, of course, highly unethical and at the same time highly unlikely in practice. And having worked for many years with survivors from the genocide case and also in Colombia, it didn't sit well with me. And I still use the term probably with a degree of discomfort. However, I think that over recent years, not least since the Colombian peace process, and of course, there have been very significant dialogues taking place at national level, but very much at local level. And of course, Rodemos has done really important work around this. I think there's now a far more critical approach to what reconciliation might mean in theory and in practice. And of course, that is often linked to enforceable rights frameworks, victims' demands, and so on and so forth. And obviously, this critical engagement has accompanied a resurgence in scholarship addressing reconciliation, as well as a more explicit, yet sadly still inadequate practitioner response around the question of reconciliation, and I'll come to that later. It's not to say that reconciliation has been an absent parent. It hasn't, right? If you look at provisions across peace agreements signed between 1975 and 2018, there are 2,798 paragraphs in peace agreements written in Spanish and English, around 250, that refer to reconciliation. So that's very substantial, right? Although they do so, perhaps unsurprisingly, from very different perspectives. But from my perspective, the concept has come really to figure within peace processes as a kind of rhetorical trope, a kind of catch-all term with very little detailed understanding of the meaning of reconciliation or any kind of driving effective indication that peace processes and negotiations might specifically be designed to pursue intergroup reconciliation as a meaningful objective. Rather, what I think happens is that the term is often employed generically to refer to a very broad set of provisions situated within the overall framework of liberal peacing and peace building and transitional justice, which of course aim to transform intergroup relations based on violence, distrust, and so forth, into relations based more on intergroup trust, compromise, cooperation, and so on and so forth. But of course, what you see if you look at these peace agreements is that the approach depends upon a very underdeveloped conceptualization of what reconciliation might mean in theory and in practice and in particular contexts, while significantly, and I think this is perhaps something we'll come to talk about, it seems to me that reconciliation has always tended to be addressed and treated as the sum of all parts of a peace process. In other words, what I mean is peacemakers seem habitually to work under the assumption that intergroup reconciliation simply follows automatically after the implementation of key core provisions in peace agreements or transitional justice mechanisms. And significantly, and again, I think highly problematic, that given the right condition, everybody wants to reconcile. And I think that's highly problematic. And the Guatemala case is, pretty on point in that respect. I think this thoughtful wishing, of course, then isn't borne out by empirical data. Victims, perpetrators, former enemies, their constituencies often reside, often live together as uneasy neighbors, and their relationships are continually shaped by mutual distrust, ongoing discrimination, memories of violence, and so forth. And of course, therefore, despite the completion of formal negotiations and the inclusion therein of generic provisions aiming towards overcoming intergroup antagonism, post-conflict coexistence remains habitually begrudging. Reconciliation is elusive. It's kind of the last thing that happens, perhaps, as communities and individuals experience the present and often imagine the future through the societal cleavages and violent hostilities of the past that drove the violence in the first place. So I think what that means is that my interest in reconciliation has stemmed partly from the perspective that conventional forms of peacemaking and peace building aren't delivering. And we all know that 40 to 60% of peace settlements collapse within 5 to 10 years. And where recidivism doesn't happen, the quality of peace, of course, is often very poor. Now, so from years working in and living in Guatemala and Colombia, working in the UN, development cooperation, and NGOs as a scholar, as Andre was saying, I think my perspective has pretty much always reflected the critiques of the overly top-down state-building approach of liberal peace building, right, or inherent to liberal peace building. The case of Guatemala, after the end of the peace process, probably most of us know, there was an abundance of new legislation, new agencies, new public policies directed towards overcoming intergroup antagonism, not one of which, and I don't think I'm exaggerating, appears to have had any significant impact upon intergroup relations or upon asymmetries of power between indigenous and non-indigenous groups, principally speaking. And I'll come to that in a moment. So it seemed to me that what happened was that you could establish all the policies, all the fancy named state institutions, the anti-discrimination legislation and so forth that you wanted, but this didn't seem to win over the hearts and minds that had been so central in winning the war in Guatemala, and of course, in enabling the permissibility of mass group destruction against the indigenous Maya population. And I'll come to that in a moment. However, reconciliation, of course, can and does work. and I think particularly at the interpersonal level. And in order to talk about failed or failing reconciliation, then of course we need also to think about successful reconciliation and about what that might mean in practice. So just briefly in that regard, in 2015, I led an investigation for the UN into the role of the so-called victims delegations that participated in the Santos FARC peace process. A very good friend of mine, Marta Luz Amorocho, whose son was killed when the FARC bombed the Nogal club in Bogota, was selected amongst 60 individuals to participate in those delegations. Marta's experience was transformative for her and for many other people in many ways, and happy to come to that in the Q&A. And after visiting the peace talks, she increasingly became involved in giving workshops and talks on peace, reconciliation, conflict, and so forth, and very often did so with a former FARC combatant at her side, and they shared the space, right? Interestingly, of course, she and others who also have sought to hold out olive branches in this respect have paid dearly, often signaled as betraying their own group or as have been ostracized as a result of efforts to reconcile or at least to engage in dialogue. And of course, as Andre knows and Gwen knows very well, highly innovative and transformative work bringing together former adversaries, perpetrators, and victims and so forth is taking place all across Colombia, right? Which hasn't happened in the case of Guatemala. And these seemingly impossible dialogues, I think, have wielded extraordinary and of course often very surprising consequences. Now, such transformations didn't occur for all of the 60 members of the victims delegations that went to Havana during the Santos FARC peace agreement. Another example would be that of Luis Mendieta, a former police commander whom the FARC refused to acknowledge as a victim during his visit. And of course, a number of other individuals who came back equally suspicious of the government and its role as a result of its attitude. Now, Andre asked me not to be overly conceptual, and I won't be, but what I did want to say was that many of these positive experiences, I think, incorporate key elements of some, in a sense, aspects and pillars of reconciliation theory, right? So they evidence transformation in antagonistic interpersonal or intergroup relations. At the interpersonal level, they demonstrate successful processes, right, through which former adversaries and their constituencies, victims and perpetrators, are able gradually to learn to coexist by radically transforming their relationship, whilst at the same time revising their own perspectives. And I think that's really important, right? Facing and overcoming their own prejudices and the perceptions of their group. I think these positive examples also show how dehumanization narratives that are central, of course, to driving conflict can be deconstructed, and that individuals can recognize and acknowledge the so-called other as part of a wider community of suffering. And I think that's something that certainly happened in my experience during the victims delegations, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. I think they also evidence the importance of the gradual reconstruction of a new web of relationships, kind of drawing on scholars like Lederach and so forth, that include the so-called former enemy and their societal and their social constituencies. And of course, a point that Gwen really importantly made earlier on, that doesn't mean the imposing of your version of the events when you're in a dialogue. And it certainly doesn't imply or necessitate the assuming of your former adversaries' values or accepting even their own version of events, right? But what it does do, I think, is kind of craft a path towards a sort of a third way, where at least what you begin to do is to trust your former enemy or adversary. You begin to repersonalize them, re-legitimize them. And of course, that's drawing on a lot of very important reconciliation theory. So in short, of course, these examples evidence that successful reconciliation requires changes in beliefs about, attitude towards, and perceptions of oneself and the other, right? And that, of course, is effectively predicated on changes in conduct and attitude, and ultimately a kind of changed psychological orientation toward the in-group and the out-group, that begins to push a path towards a moment in which groups no longer see each other and their relationship as kind of zero sum, right? And see the past as effectively defining the future. And that can take place across, as we know very well, a whole diverse area of dimensions, intergroup, intercommunal, dyadic relationships, as Brandon and Kelly talk so eloquently about, and so on. So, of course, at its most basic level, that's been defined as thin reconciliation, so something kind of akin to negative peace, moving across a spectrum towards something more like thick reconciliation, which of course significantly may include the redress of the structural causes of conflict, among other elements. Okay, so how might that work, if at all, at a societal level, right? Can we, and I use it again with trepidation, can we upscale reconciliation processes from the interpersonal level, from the local level, from the communal level? How do we stop seeing the adversary as a threat? We've been constructing them as a threat for a very long time, most likely. How can we begin to eliminate the cognitive foundation of the conflict? And I think significantly also begin to abolish, or at least postpone, the military, political, economic, and societal dreams and objectives that may have laid the foundation for the violence in the first place, right? Of course, these are very significantly tricky, important questions to start thinking about. But my worry with kind of local level reconciliation processes, equally with local level peace building, is that it's very difficult to upscale, particularly when armed actors maintain the prerogative, right? When national policies don't coincide. And we can come back to that later. Okay, so Guatemala, very briefly. So the armed conflict was 36 years, began in 1960, culminated in 1981, 1983 in a genocide against the indigenous Maya. The Maya, in part at least, represented the guerrillas' rural social base, rural support base, and the military logic behind its genocide was to drain the sea to kill the fish, which effectively worked in the most tragic of ways, of course, producing an enormous humanitarian disaster. But in the end, the conflict comes to a formal end in 1996, following a relatively successful internationally monitored peace process. 9 years of peace negotiations bring with them a successful DDR process with the guerrilla, their transformation into a political party, as well as a significant, I think, recalibration, at least on paper, of Guatemala's genocidal state. So in short, the agreements contemplated a broad range of legal, political, to a certain degree, religious, economic, although very much lacking, and social reforms, some of which were partially implemented, right? And of course, importantly, Guatemala's armed conflict, unlike many others, has not relapsed. Okay, so I think that's an important achievement in that regard. However, peace in Guatemala, of course, means very little. Structural violence continues to affect the most poor and the most marginalized, above all of indigenous origin. The terms of the peace settlement itself are challenged daily by the military, by the political elite, by the economic elite. Escalating criminal violence, ongoing political violence threaten the country's peace deal and continue to do so. And so in a sense, and I know James Hughes has made a really important similar point around Northern Ireland in this regard, despite what's been elite political accommodation, reconciliation at the communal level and probably more broadly, societally speaking, has been limited, very limited. 4 decades after the killing campaign began, in fact, Guatemala's racialized Cold War narrative still retains enormously powerful currency and meaning. So what does that mean? Well, I think otherness in Guatemala has historically been and remains egregiously destructive, right? Moral universalism in Guatemala, as elsewhere, is a fiction. Guatemala's violent elites continue to deny the mutual humanity of indigenous people and also of poor non-indigenous people. So in spite of what's been unprecedented and sustained everyday contact, important transitional justice mechanisms, an unprecedented peace agreement, prejudice against and stereotyping of indigenous Guatemalans, continues, along with the emergence of new hatreds and new resentments. There have been few, if any, attempts to deliver inter-group dialogue at local and national levels, such as those taking place in Colombia, which I think is significant. And moreover, there's been no generation of a kind of common identity, right? Communal identities actually, on the contrary, have hardened in the aftermath of the peace agreement. So in the end, the ideological and identitarian frameworks that sculpted polarization precipitated the onset of violence and shaped the trajectory of hostilities ultimately culminating in genocide remain in place. War ideologies then and identities are embedded in Guatemala. And the argument for me is this is the case above all because of the violent rejection by the economic and political elite across all levels of society of economic and potential political transformation. In this context, political and economic elites, although of course not only elites, and we can come back to that, continue to mobilize a racialized discourse linked to a narrative of communist subversion and the so-called subhuman Indian threat. And this retains Guatemala, I think, on a permanent war footing and in a state of de facto segregation, right? The military and political and economic elites also systematically opposed the two Truth Commission's reports and are continuingly rejecting the convictions of military officials for human rights violations. And I think what this does is it evidences that the elite in Guatemala refuses to revise Guatemala's conflict history, right? And as we know, reconciliation is only likely to occur if actors revise their belief in the fundamental justness of their conflict goals, change how they stereotype their former adversaries, and shift away from self-glorification narratives. Okay, so my argument has been then that in Guatemala, liberal peace building and transitional justice mechanisms have really done very little, given what is the absence of political will at the elite level. And reconciliation then is failing because collective beliefs and perceptions in Guatemala have changed very slowly, if at all, given that powerful groups continue to benefit from the status quo, to instrumentalize historical cleavages, and publicly to oppose post-accord narratives of inclusion. Now, this state of affairs, of course, prevents meaningful challenge to elite privilege, prerogative, and power in the country. And of course, that's one of its goals in the first place. And reconciliation then appears to be failing as historical power asymmetries perdure, right? In fact, I would argue that the unfinished business in literal terms of the war festers and hasn't healed with time. Past, present, and future very often seem to be indelibly imprinted upon one another. People live the past as they live the present, which defines the future. And that leads to poor quality peace at worst, and at worst to some kind of conflict relapse. Okay, so to close then, I also argue that changes in perceptions and in intergroup relations are fundamental for reconciliation, but of course they're insufficient. And that's no surprise, I think, to anybody, and must be accompanied by significant economic and political transformation, in short, by the dismantling of power asymmetries, of horizontal inequalities, and so forth, which of course often played a role in the onset and trajectory of the violence in the first place, right? In fact, it may be that the changes in intergroup relations will not take place unless structural transformation, wider structural transformation, incremental power sharing, and economic justice begin to move forward. And of course, the problem is that liberal peace building and transitional justice mechanisms rarely, if at all, do this. And of course, that's one of the fundamental critiques of transitional justice. So to end then, perhaps we need to develop a distinct approach to reconciliation that, whilst linked to respective peace negotiations and settlements inevitably, right, isn't constrained by their inevitable shortcomings. And of course, that's the challenge. One way of doing this is probably to make reconciliation matter more explicitly within peace negotiations, not to let it be kicked down the field until apparently more urgent issues have been redressed in the peace negotiations, but place it at the fore of negotiations. This would require, of course, specific context-driven and theoretically robust provisions to be incorporated within peace negotiations for overcoming intergroup reconciliation. Provisions that are also linked to wider structural transformation, right? You can't do the one without the other, I argue. At the same time, I'd also argue that peacemakers need to incorporate widespread local mechanisms for intergroup dialogue as central to peace processes, right? This would imply a local term in reconciliation and a reconciliation term in peacemaking. Such mechanisms would need to be articulated, I think, with mechanisms at the national level to prevent replicating some of the key problems that have emerged as a result of local level peace building around the kind of creation of islands of impact, right, that don't sort of travel. Antonio Machado argued that, and I'm quoting, "The other refuses to disappear. It subsists, it persists. It is the hard bone upon which reason breaks its teeth." And of course, reconciliation is all about that, right? It's about trying to acknowledge the other and move forward in that regard. So maybe we need to begin to think about how we understand reason, right? We need to be more creative if we're to find any way of disarming what is destructive othering and tread a path towards a more transformative dialogue. Hopefully that will bring up some of the issues that we can discuss, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Roddy. It's a fantastic and thought-provoking sort of presentation, and I want to get back to you with one first sort of reflection and question, and see how we can build this from here. And is focusing on the case of Colombia. I just think that you have used the case of Colombia as a successful idea of reconciliation to try to compare a bit with Guatemala. But I find your concept so interesting in failing reconciliation, and the case of Guatemala seems like a mirror to Colombia, only that Colombia is 20 years behind. Colombia is in the earliest steps of an implementation of a peace agreement that includes the word reconciliation quite a lot. And that is created these local initiatives and encounters of people, as you have rightly suggested. However, and the transitional justice institutions are working. Just yesterday, one of the chief commanders of the paramilitary groups was talking to the Truth Commission in Colombia, naming the army generals who participated in the creation of paramilitary groups who carried out massacres in the north of Colombia. So you would think that all of this is bringing a really important structural transformation, or is open the possibilities for that. But Colombian society is polarized more than ever. The people who see the Truth Commission as a threat are not only the economic elites or the political elites who are worried that the Truth Commission is going to unveil the truth of things that have never been told, but actually the people, like the normal people on the ground, and is due to identities. Many people in Colombia feel that their identity is in a way linked to the former Colombian president Álvaro Uribe. They say that they are more Uribistas than Uribe himself. So, they are, it becomes, and this makes the possibility of reconciliation very, very difficult. So, in a way, what I wanted to ask you is, how can we use the idea of failing reconciliation, or what you have seen in Guatemala, to try to do an analysis of the challenges that Colombia faces in this moment? And what possible way forwards do you see for this to happen?
Thanks, Andre. Brilliant reflection. And hopefully this is more of a dialogue than necessarily my answering the question. Yeah, I mean, I think I fully agree more with effectively everything you said. Apart from, I mean, perhaps I certainly don't think that the Colombia case is a case of successful reconciliation, right? I think what certainly has been successful are what were extraordinary dialogues, right? That one would have believed impossible 5-6 years ago taking place. The fundamentally important changes at the interpersonal level that the victims' delegations precipitated, not for everybody that took part in them, as you know very well, right? Perhaps for a majority. And I spent a good long time, and this is what I guess my book's about, engaging with this issue. And it seemed to me that the fact that it appeared in 2015, 2014, that the Colombian state was kind of open to a dialogue, right? That really began to move things forward. And I think that has an effect at the societal level in terms of potentially facilitating this space. But of course, it also brings kickback, as you rightly say. It also, unsurprisingly, I think, has meant that as a result of the following presidential campaign, and of course, the election of the current president and so forth, spoiling actors have become even stronger in Colombia. And I think you're right to point out, and this is another problem with the literature, right? The literature is very often focused very much upon elite actors as the key spoiling actors in peace processes and reconciliation processes. And I think that's highly ill-advised. And we can think about a way in which, how might a peace process begin to reach this kind of so-called bystander population, right? The population that either thinks it had nothing to do with the conflict, right, or wasn't affected by the conflict, or isn't interested in it. And of course, there's always going to be fatigue, right? People are going to get tired to death of this stuff. So I guess, on the other hand, as you rightly say, there is very significant, or there are very significant developments in Colombia around the HEP and the Truth Commission and so forth that haven't happened in Guatemala. In Guatemala, what was immediate in the aftermath of both Truth Commissions, the Catholic Church Truth Commission, Guatemala Nunca Más, 56 hours after it was published, it was launched in the cathedral. I was there doing my PhD research in 1998. Gerardi was murdered by the military, right? The following year, the UN-sponsored Truth Commission, the CH, was, when it was launched, President Arzu refused publicly to accept the Truth Commission or to shake the commissioner's hand when it was launched in the National Theatre. And of course, that evidenced that the Guatemalan elite, political and economic, was also not going in any way whatsoever to revise its conflict history, right? To reflect upon self-glorification narratives and so on. So in terms of sort of ways to move forward, you're also right by identifying the fact that I don't even think it's 20 years. I think it's much less than that. What we're seeing in Colombia is what we saw within the space of 2 or 3 years in Guatemala, maybe a little bit more. This year it's the 5th anniversary of the Guatemalan, of the Colombian peace agreement, and of course the 25th anniversary of the Guatemalan peace agreement, right? So I think what needs to happen, and this I know was mentioned to the negotiating parties in Havana, but there was very little interest in it, and it's a point that I raised earlier on. How do you begin to replicate what has been a very effective accommodation between elites that a few years previously wanted to kill each other, right? How do you begin to replicate that at local level? And I think what needs to happen are kind of some of the important elements that happened in Burundi, for example, right? Local level spaces of encounter that have their own dynamic, that take a long, long time. And of course, the point is both Guatemala and Colombia, both countries rejected their peace packages. So again, that's another aspect. And I think in the Guatemala case, we've been, this has now been a couple of generations. The Colombia case, this is all happening very, very fast. So I would say, you know, you folks are doing brilliant lobbying. There needs to be the formalization of spaces, but how can you do that when, reflecting the Guatemala case, you have a president and an economic elite that is systematically attacking the architecture that emerged out of the peace process, that isn't supporting it, where you have also, you know, widespread killing of social activists, former FARC combatants, and so on and so forth. So the task is enormous. There's no question about it, but urgent.
Thanks, Roddy. I think I want to invite people to start thinking about comments or questions. We don't need to, you know, you don't need to ask a question. You could just come up with a comment or ideas. I think one of the reasons why we thought about this dialogue was because Roddy is, you know, also wanted to gather this information to continue writing a bit what he's been working on. So, you know, comments and ideas are very welcome. But before you do that and you start putting your ideas together, I want to make a final sort of comment or sort of, again, to just hear some response from Roddy. And I think, you know, there was something really important that you said that it really got to the deep of my mind when you were talking about this. Was, I mean, why are gonna people reconcile straight away? There are some people who do not want to reconcile. I mean, it's a tough process. In the case of Colombia, thinking about the last hearings of the HEP, where we discovered that there were more than 6,402 extrajudicial killings, so-called falsos positivos, in which the army killed innocent people and dressed them up as civilians and as combatants, sorry, and then, you know, buried the bodies in the middle of the jungle, and then said that they have been killed in the middle of conflict, on the conflict. I mean, some of those mothers do not want to reconcile. This is not a moment for reconciliation. So, in a way, when you suggest this idea that peace process should include reconciliation as part of the negotiations, to have like an element there, isn't this a bit like a bit too difficult? Aren't we trying to merge two times that probably are not possible to reconcile? Aren't we trying to synchronize like the time of peacemaking or, you know, negotiations with the time of reconciliation? Because they seem to go into a different speed. They seem to emerge from the local realities. They seem to emerge from actually the autonomy of many people. You know, reconciliation seems not, you know, you can invite many people to these encounters, but they might not come, and you might not invite anyone. And then you can have someone like Marta Luisa Morocho, or you can have someone like Berta Lucia Fries, who, by the way, is going to be our next speaker, who actually decides that reconciliation is her crusade. And the reason why she could do it is because it's not framed within the negotiations. It's because it's not framed within the idea of the peace process as such. So how to reconcile that sort of contradictory idea? Shall we really aim for that?
Look, I think that's a very, very good point. The timing question is really important, right? The timing question is really important, as is the question, of course, of expectations, right? I think clearly to have spaces of encounter during a peace process is fairly unfeasible, but I don't think that means that they can't be established as a potential pillar for the aftermath, right? For the peace building process, right? And I think I certainly wasn't imagining that they had to take place simultaneously with peace negotiations, but I certainly think that if you don't do it during a peace, if you don't consolidate and make it informal, right? During or within a peace agreement, it may make it even harder to come back to in the future. And that's not to say, as you rightly point out, Andre, look, I mean, I think what's really interesting, and I'm waiting to see if we get funding for it, for a big project, which will hopefully involve Rodemos. What's really important is what happens at local level, right? So in those spaces, inevitably where top-down processes don't reach, and if they do reach, they don't reach very well. What happens, for example, I always use the same case. In Guatemala, there was a village I spent a lot of time in when I was preparing the evidence for the genocide trial in the Ishua region. And the person that was in charge of the tienda, of the shop, was an individual that was linked to paramilitary groups. And in turn, of course, linked to the military, right? And of course, had been involved very substantially with the killings and the massacres, right? Now, what do you do when you need every week or every other day to go and buy your beans or your rice or your washing powder or whatever, right? How do you deal with that? How do you engage with that? And I think what we haven't looked at enough in the scholarship on reconciliation are the microdynamics, right? There's a lot of work done by Calibas, which is brilliant, on the microdynamics during conflict, right? But I don't think we pay enough attention on the microdynamics in the aftermath of conflict, right? So I think what's really fundamental is how individuals who perhaps may be victims of this person, how do you deal with that? Do you forget about it? Do you make a joke about it? Are you silent about it? Do you approach them? And as you rightly say, you know, this stuff has its own time. You can't legislate, I don't think, and you can't develop public policies necessarily to force people to reconcile. It's not going to happen. And people don't reconcile. In the case of Guatemala, I mentioned the political and economic elite for a whole series of reasons, right? So it's a very interesting point, Andre.
Thanks, Brody. I know that, you know, Simon has been working Simon Keys at the Center for Religion, Reconciliation and Peace has been working for a long time on these issues too, and reflecting on this. And in this moment, it would be a good idea to also, you know, he has asked me to let him make some comments and questions. So Simon, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Roddy. That was a wonderful presentation full of really, really interesting things. And even to someone like myself who knows very little about Guatemala, you picked out some really big themes there that apply to many situations, I think. I mean, my initial reaction is wondering whether we are trying to put too much weight on the concept of reconciliation. And I'm wondering increasingly whether reconciliation, if you like, is just one element of peace building that has to be set alongside other things. And I absolutely take your point that the pernicious use of the word reconciliation to promise things that are not deliverable, those rhetorical tropes you talked about, is in itself a huge form of injustice. And it's a way of corrupt elites getting out of jail, you know, getting a get out of jail card free. So I mean, kind of thinking about reconciliation in a more narrow way actually increases the chance of seeing it as a successful project. And I was really pleased to hear what you said about reconciliation, you know, particularly at the grassroots level, being able to tackle intergroup prejudice, individual, you know, revisions of that people's perceptions, the rebuilding of relationships. All those things are positive, and that's what reconciliation is about. But maybe it is too much to expect reconciliation to offer. Well, maybe I'll put this as a question: what could reconciliation offer elites who, with huge vested interests, who are being asked to give up privilege That's the problem, isn't it? For society to change, they have to give up huge vested interest and privilege. And what process is actually going to incentivize that? And the difficulty with reconciliation is it talks about, in terms of the outcome of reconciliation, is increased harmony, more peaceful cooperation. It doesn't compensate for the huge assets that elites have acquired and want to hang on to. So a number of thoughts there. I don't know whether you want to come back on any of that.
Yeah,
brilliant. Thank you, Simon. Roddy, I'm going to collect some questions because
great.
Colin from Canada, I think, is been writing on the chat, and I know that you've been writing something there, but I wonder whether you would like to ask your question or make your comment so that Roddy can hear you. Please.
Yes, thank you. I was just suggesting that one of the things we are learning in the field of peace psychology is that the focus must be on the dismantling of the fear rather than the building of the peace. Because if, like, for example, with the Israelis, we find that who are entrenched in privilege and a sense of entitlement, that when we help them to remember back to the origins of their own faith, for example, to journey, to sojourn, then there is a reason or a new cause or a new narrative upon which they can reach across or bring down their defenses or soften in terms of what they're there for. What is the purpose now of the Jewish nation? To make friends with their fellow sojourners, the Palestinian people. I think it's really, as you were talking about, Simon, really apropos that we deepen our intent of dialogue and the level we go to, so that we don't just talk and share stories, that we have the courage, maybe with the companionship of skilled practitioners, we go into those shadowed places of power where humiliation and shame and fear of loss lie. And we help people to see deeper into their nature, that they want to belong, they want to care, they want to love others. They maybe are very entrenched, but I see Scott Altrin's name here, I think a while ago, maybe it's gone now, who's done a lot of work at Oxford in terms of the warriors who really speak to belonging as what entrenches them. And if it doesn't find a better path, it just solidifies and intensifies. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you so much. And then the final person in this round, because I've seen more people putting their hand up, and that's brilliant, and I encourage the rest to also do so. The last person in this round would be Maria Lucia Zapata. So Maria Lucia, over to you.
Hi. Hola, Roddy. Hi.
Hola.
Maria Lucia Zapata. I'm from Javeriana University in Bogota. Thank you, Roddy, for the presentation, and I think it raised provocative discussions and debates on the term of reconciliation. And something that I am been reflecting a lot about is dialogues. And then you highlight a lot about that, perhaps in comparison between Colombia and Guatemala, is that Colombia has important experiences in terms of dialogues. And it seems that it's becoming like the fashion in Colombia now, talking about dialogues. And it's becoming in a way like improbable dialogues and the cliche of the dialogue. And it's bothering me because from the work that we are doing south in Vistalbosa, Meta, the amount of accompaniment that dialogue requires is enormous. And I think that we can have dialogues between people sharing pleasantries about how beautiful the country is and blah, blah, blah. But real meaningful dialogues, it's huge amount of work. And perhaps one of the main outcomes is that I don't want to dialogue, and which is good also, that people have clear understanding of the conflict and their position about the conflict and said, you know, I am not ready to dialogue with you right now. And that it's something that it's something important. So, and I'm wondering, perhaps maybe we should discuss about the quality of dialogues, because the spectacle of dialogue that former combatants and victims meet and they share experiences, it's at some level, and that might work for people to say, okay, this is possible. But also there is deeper and deeper amount of dialogue that requires, as I said, accompaniment. And my question, or perhaps my reflection is, first we have to be ready to think dialogue will take a lot of time, decades. I mean, we are still discussing about 1948, the La Violencia. Also the quality of dialogue, and how can we not perhaps measure, but how can we see that quality? And second, and third, how can we support that? What type of accompaniment we can do? And I've been thinking that having studied restorative justice, perhaps there are some answers there. Perhaps not. I mean, in restorative justice, there is the stereotype that there has to be victim offender mediation, and not really. You can do a restorative justice work just with victims or just with offenders apart, just by helping understand the impact of what happened. So I'm thinking that a very well thought restorative justice, applying restorative justice principles, can help us. I don't have an answer of how and when and where, but I think that restorative justice linked with dialogue can help us a little bit. So I wonder if you can, you know, Colombia, you know, what we have done, if you can share some thoughts about quality of dialogue and accompaniment.
Roddy, I thank you, Maria Lucia. Thank you so much. I think, you know, we have collected some thoughts, and in the spirit of dialogue, don't feel that you need to answer them as questions. Just take them as food for thought. And why don't you just get back to us with some ideas so that we can offer more food for thought, and then go back to the floor and collect some other questions to, you know, use many different brains to see where they take us.
Great, thank you for that caveat. Really, really important and interesting comments, so much in there. I mean, I guess the first thing I'd start with, it's really hard to understand, you know, believe me, I really, as I said at the beginning of this talk, for me, the question of reconciliation was always so very far from my thinking and my practice, right? I mean, I spent probably 10 years involved in the legal trial against Rios Montt. We all suffered as a result of that trial, of course, some more than others. And reconciliation was the last thing on anybody's mind, right? The first thing on everybody's mind was justice. And of course, no peace without justice, no reconciliation without justice. Really important lemmas, right? That, of course, still ring true in many cases. And so, in a sense, as I equally said, I've used the term with trepidation, but I'm fascinated by it, right? And I'm fascinated by why it might happen and why it doesn't happen, right? And one, I think, important question is also to think about the idea of, you know, how do we balance the fact, how do we balance giving time for processes to move forward on their own, right? Because inevitably they'll need that at local level, particularly when you have intimate conflicts, when you have conflicts that are very territorialized, if you like. How do we give space for that to move forward on its own, with perhaps giving pointers here and there and support? But how do we balance that with the fact that we've got to stop the killing? And the killing is going on and on and on. And the further down the line you get, the more difficult perhaps it is to come back, the more difficult perhaps it is to begin to mend that not only ripped fabric, but utterly destroyed fabric, right? And in a way, I guess the question of what elites, what can you offer elites? I don't think you can offer them anything, Simon. I think in Guatemala, you can't offer them anything. And I think that's why it's still a zero-sum game, right? That's why nobody talks about reconciliation. Why would they? They have absolutely no reason to. And I think in a way, kind of my sort of point of call is the question of the state. It's the state's responsibility to do stuff. We know that. And in these cases, the state has done utterly nothing, right? And that's why kind of to sort of come back to Maria Lucia's brilliant observation. In Guatemala, I remember we got so exhausted as well with dialogue. There'd be mesas de diálogo for whatever situation, right? Oh, there's a problem with taxis. Quick, establish, because the international community loves it, right? Establish a mesa de diálogo and everybody's going to be really happy. And of course, it's never diálogo, it's monólogo, right? Because what you get is that the powerful people there go in, they listen, and they walk away when it comes to making decisions, if they even listen, right? So the point is, does this take us back to some of the weaknesses of the predominant peace building model? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. The point is they can walk away at any point and invariably do so. And I think, Maria, that in terms of sort of quality of dialogue, for me, what I found that the delegaciones de víctimas, the victims delegations, the spaces that were established were really important, and I hadn't seen those sorts of spaces before. In a way, you've got a mechanism that's hybrid. It's part truth commission, private, right? And it's part peacemaking process, peacemaking mechanism, right? And I think that was really significant because it hadn't happened before. The Guatemala peace process had the civil society assembly, right? But it wasn't directly sitting at the negotiation process table. And in a way, what I felt listening to the individuals that have been involved in that, on all sides, not just the members of the victims delegations, was that space, to a certain degree, established some of the core principles for the transitional justice architecture. And it did so very much along the lines of, let's have an integral approach to transitional justice that's less about penal sanctions and more about balancing truth and reparations. Of course, the problem would have been if the victims had gone to Havana and said, you all need to go to prison, right? Which most of them didn't. So in a sense, it kind of, did it rubber stamp what the negotiating parties were hoping for? Maybe. But what it also did, I think, was provide spaces in which 60 out of 8 million, 9 million people, right? Of course, in its due proportion, 60 out of 8 or 9 million individuals had the opportunity to look their, as they always said to me victimario, right? To look their perpetrator in the eye and to tell them what had happened. And the process that begun, of course, it wasn't given continuity. It was a 2-day thing and then it ended, right? And then they flew back to Guatemala, to Colombia, and had to face a society in which Uribistas were instrumentalizing the people that had gone on the victims delegations, and which, death threats came to 45% of the 60 people that went, sometimes once, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times. And so it was a very isolated space, but that space provided them, so many of them said, we've come back and we don't have nightmares anymore. Now that was in 2015, 2016. I wonder the degree to which that process of moving on, right, of beginning steps towards conciliation, not necessarily reconciliation, is still the case now when you've got a situation in which the killing is horrendous, in which people can't leave their houses, in which Tumaco, and Buenaventura are basically being controlled by paramilitaries, right? So of course, the individual processes at the individual level, I don't think are isolated from wider political processes, right? That makes sense. So just some thoughts, Andre.
Thank you, Roddy. I mean, I have to say that I'm trying to play the role of the chair and let others speak, because I just feel like there's so much richness in what you just have said, but I'm going to keep some of my thought process for the wrapping up and give the chance to other people to really, bring their ideas and to put them on the table. So Gwen, over to you.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you so much, Roddy. Really interesting talk, and really interesting to hear the comparative experience as well. I have two kind of comments that I'd love to know what you think about them, comments or questions. The first one is, I really appreciate your attention to the complexities or the problematization of this desire to scale up reconciliation processes. I think in Colombia, the examples that you point out, we're not just talking about grassroots, local community level reconciliation. We're talking about major encounters between victims and perpetrators, between victims and society as well, to be able to tell their experiences to a wider audience, the Encuentros por la Verdad that the Truth Commission has organized. And, I think those are really, really important, as you highlighted. I think quite often we tend to think about reconciliation either as between victims and perpetrators or between former enemies. But actually, I think in Colombia, it's been very clear that there's a need for reconciliation at a much wider level, what I kind of think of as social reconciliation. And I think that has been happening, as you've been highlighting, in sort of pockets. I think Andre used to have a concept of pockets of peace, which your discussion made me remember. But when you ask about scaling up, I wonder, it made me think, why scale up, or why to try to scale up reconciliation to a country level or a society level? Is there any country that is reconciled? Is Germany reconciled? Is England reconciled? Right now, it doesn't really feel like it, does it? So, what is the utility of applying the concept of reconciliation, which generally refers to those other processes, to that kind of wider society thing? Because aren't we really thinking about the problem in Colombia is not one of failed reconciliation, it's a failure of a shift in public opinion and political identities. So I wonder why do we need to have reconciliation on the table in that discussion? And then the other question that I had was about the word failed. And I remember a conversation that we had, failed or failing, and I appreciate your nuance there. I know you stressed the importance of endpoints there, and I know you were careful not to suggest that the Colombian peace process or reconciliation had failed sort of per se. I remember a very complicated moment in about maybe 8 months after Iván Duque took power. Andre and I did one of our early Embrace Dialogue Academia meetings in LSE with Jenny Pierce, and it was a really critical moment. I can't remember why. It was one of those moments when everything just seemed to be absolutely falling to pieces. And I asked Jenny Pierce, at what point, who was our guest speaker that day, at what point do we say this is a failing peace process? It wasn't reconciliation, it was a peace process. And she called my attention to something which really convinced me, and I really hold on to, and I continue to believe in, which I wonder what you think about it, is what does it mean for us as academics to use that word, failed or failing, when there are so many people putting their lives literally on the line, both social leaders, peace activists, but also people in state institutions like the HIP, like the Truth Commission, working all hours of day and night without extra pay, in bad conditions, under threat, under pressure from their families, from society. What does it mean for us as researchers to sit in the UK and say that process over there is failing? What is our ethical commitment to our interlocutors when we start to use those words? And I know that other people do. I know Francisco Gutierrez has, very prominently taken the position that the peace process is a failed peace process. And he has his own kind of political calculation when he's making that stance. But Also regarding positionality, I think it's different when a Colombian researcher says it than when a non-Colombian researcher says it. And I'm sure you'd have interesting thoughts about that too. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on those two kind of provocations to your provocation.
Fantastic, Gwen. Let's move to Carl Stauffer.
Thank you. This has been a very rich dialogue. I really appreciate preparing it, and also Roddy for your presentation and others. This is really important work, and I was intrigued with the failed reconciliation concept to begin with. So very glad I'm here, because I'm one that's working in it, and I'm currently just with United States Institute for Peace in a reconciliation portfolio for their inclusive peace processes. My experience comes out of South Africa, which, if you want to talk about a failed reconciliation process, you could also hold them up very clearly in that process. And I think, so I won't go into all, I think you analyzed it, and we could have put that frame on South Africa very easily. Also, so I want to say something that was my background is in restorative justice, and so I really wanted to jump on the comment by Maria Lucia about restorative justice, and I'm coming out of that field, putting that into the reconciliation mix, or I have been for many years, and I'm still not sure. There's a lot of solidification that needs to happen in that thinking, but yes, I think restorative justice has a huge promise for us. The problem is that we have isolated restorative justice to the criminal legal system and this sort of victim offender thing. And we need to take it out of that, first of all, free it from that, and begin to study restorative justice as a social justice movement. And if we're beginning to study it as a social justice movement, then we begin to see its application in many spheres across society. And in the last few years, the research has been burgeoning exceptionally fast, the theory and the research, and we're seeing this applications in the educational system, the environmental system, the health and public health systems, et cetera, et cetera. And so I do believe, as controversial as it is, that restorative justice is in fact a social movement to change cultural attitude around the concept of justice. And it's moving us towards this idea of human justice, or satisfying justice that is a healing justice, as Dr. Fania Davis says in the United States. And when we think of it that way, I'm not sure how that works with transitional justice, though I've been using that as a critique for some time, because I think what we need to, I'm not sure what it looks like, but if we look at the social movement theory, we have to understand that it's about this many moving parts in a decentralized system. And we borrow from the natural system in that process too. My colleague Philip Visser in South Africa used to say, we interlocking spheres of dialogue across all sectors of society is sort of what we're needing. Now, then I heard the fatigue of dialogue from Maria too. And so I think her questions are very, very important to ask. But I'm struck by, for instance, the unrest in South Africa. One of the I think creative thinking that has come out of it is saying, why don't we have mini truth commissions over and over again? It should be part of a governmental political process. We need a truth commission on land affairs right now. We need a truth commission on gender conflict and violence. We need a truth commission on school fees. You know, when this whole movement of the university students around the colonization and the decolonization of the education and the fees and so on. So I think there's a place to think about what would a decentralized structure look like at a local level where local ownership can happen too. Now, the question is, how does that impact the central state, which is the elite and the beneficiary one? So I don't really have a answer there. I don't know who does, but I think if there's enough pressure from the bottom up, we're beginning to understand that. And I'm particularly intrigued with what I would call transitional justice from the bottom up. And some of my research has revolved around Sierra Leone's Femble Talk process, an indigenous process that has pushed justice from the bottom up. And that makes a very interesting case, I believe, even though they don't use the word justice or transitional justice or even restorative justice. I think they have accomplished that in their goal of healing at a community level using an indigenous process. And I think it behooves us to take a look at those kinds of models. I'll stop now.
Carl, thank you so much. It makes me think. I mean, really, and I don't want to monopolize this, and I don't want Colombia to become the case study for everyone. But some of the things that you are saying, they're just so connected to Colombia, and it'll be interesting to hear Roddy's reflections on that, because in Colombia, the transitional justice mechanism is with a restorative justice focus, and because in Colombia, Afro-Colombian communities have been working for a long time suggesting this idea that the special jurisdiction for peace can deliver some of the Afro-Colombian transitional justice or restorative justice process that they want. And all this work from the bottom up actually resulted, according to so many people would argue, into the transitional justice mechanism that was created in Havana, as Roddy was saying. But let me go back to Derry, the last person who is going to make a final comment and question in order for us to get back to Roddy and then start wrapping up.
Hi, Andre. Thanks very much. Roddy, thank you very much as well. Been really fascinating talk and dialogue and all the contributions. Kind of just to keep it very Colombian, I'm going to start by saying more comments on a question, which will then obviously divert into 3 or 4 different comments. Just, keeping it real, as it were. No, I mean, just because there's a lot of food for thought, I think it's been very valuable. I mean, it made me think of a talk I had recently. It was focused on Northern Ireland. I talk around resistant victims, but resistant victims, those who don't maybe necessarily go along with, move on, but they still want to know the truth about, their relatives or whatever it is. But are they seen as the bad victims because they're stopping reconciliation, stopping society moving on? So I think that's a good point. On the other hand, there's also lots of victims organizations in Northern Ireland, as there are in Spain and Colombia, that actually very much instrumentalize this idea of loss and victimhood in order to make political points. So, I mean, I think it's very true. So, and then are we just kind of looking at it from an ideological point of view? It's like, well, some victims should be resistant, but others, should just move on, and we all have our own ideas on that, I'm sure. The other thing that made me think recently was also kind of about reconciliation and equality of dialogue. I think that's really important. And then what you, as Maria Lucia said, and you brought up about, the power dynamics of forums. Powerful people come, they might listen, but there's no decision made, there's no outcome. I think that's a key point, linking to your transformation point, because unless you're getting people, that are the victims, that are the underprivileged, that are the marginalized, kind of having that input really into decisions, I think it's very difficult that there will be that structural transformation. I'm going to slightly touch on what Carl said. I have a lot of time for restorative justice, but I think the very name gives it away. Like, it restores people to something past. I know it has gone beyond that, but a lot of the time what you're restoring people to is maybe not a good situation. So that's why we need to move more towards transformative justice, I would say. But the other thing, going back to Colombia, around, for example, Diana Rico has got some recent work, which is about the ETSR, the FARC demobilized camps in Honduras and Tierra Grata, and about this kind of idea of kind of reconciliation through action. So it's very much around services, things like that. The demobilized communities working with other local communities in order to get water. I did some work in that area myself and was told the same by local communities close to the ETS area. So that's a kind of reconciliation through action rather than let's get together in a space for dialogue. So could that be a more productive, sorry, just passing the baby on, more productive way of of doing things. I think it's kind of when people have a common purpose, they're actually more likely to see that, and not just instrumentally. Maybe it starts instrumentally, but I think that can actually create kind of a deeper connection and a more social network. Again, I think it was one of the Rodemos Hidalgo ones around football, wasn't it? Where Pete was talking about, well, yeah, you can get people together to play football, and but what really makes that have long-lasting impacts? I think that's the same for all sorts of activities. It's not just getting together from time to time, it's actually having a common purpose. So anyway, I'm starting to ramble, so I'll stop there. So just to say again, thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you, Derek. It's amazing. So I guess, it's going to be 7:30. I would like to give the chance to Roddy to respond with some thoughts, some ideas to wrap up this dialogue in 6 minutes or so. And if you all bear with me, we will try to close this space maximum in 10 minutes time. So at 7:40 UK time, whatever time difference you have. So Roddy, let's get back to you and just, some food for thought, because I think we're not gonna, be able to bring it to an end. There is an open discussion.
Yeah, no, and I think, this is what this is about. It's a dialogue, right? So lots of really important issues raised, and I'm really grateful. And it's nice to be able to go back to my hopefully my final draft. There's never a final draft, right? As much as there's never reconciliation, there's never a final draft, to go back with some of your really important ideas. So Gwen, that's a really great question, right? Why feel the prerogative, why feel the obligation to scale up, to upscale? I sort of came at this, first of all, thinking from the perspective of peace building, right? Now, having kind of spent a lot of time thinking about local level peace building, local level peace building, of course, has really important positive elements to it and advantages. It's very often seen as legitimate. It's very often able to orchestrate more buy-in, which is a horrible term, but people feel they have a stake in what's happening at local level, right? And if you look at the Latin American context, the local is often far more important than the national. I think we know that very well. What happens in local politics is really meaningful in Central America and in Colombia. And so, in a way, my take on the local level peace building, this is what I worked up with the UN. The UN's focus in Redes, Reconciliación y Desarrollo, was very much about local level peace building, right? And it was based on kind of Labor Act's propositions. And I think the problem was that very often you could have an important punctual temporary impact that wouldn't last. And when you're surrounded by a sea of violence, right? So islands of impact is how I saw it. When you're surrounded by a sea of violence, when you've got a state that couldn't give a damn, on the contrary, is desperate to get at the minerals under your land, and so on and so forth. You know the story as well as I do. Then, Mary Anderson, a long time ago, argued that a thousand local level peace building initiatives don't bring peace to a country. And I think my problem is very much that, is that you don't begin to build up a kind of so-called infrastructure of peace. And I think, I wonder if it's fairly similar when we're thinking about reconciliation. How useful is it to have a community in Meta or in Putumayo that's been able to resolve their differences to a certain degree when the next town along hasn't, when the next town along is absolutely riven with violence? It's going to be complicated, isn't it? And I think kind of coming back to Labor Act's notion of, a spider's web, sort of building up strong networks across a country, that always seemed to make a bit of sense to me. And I think particularly, of course, it's a very fundamental problem. How do you begin to do that when you have a state that negates these processes? So that would be kind of my first reaction. I'm happy for this to be a conversation to keep thinking about it. Question of the failure issue. You know, I don't think we can say the Colombian peace process has failed. I think it's too early. I think it's failing, and it's got horrendous issues, but it so have 40 to 60%, if not more, of all the other peace processes that have been signed over the last 20 to 30 years. The Colombia case, you don't have widespread recidivism, right? There's dissidents, of course, as well as all of the horrendous killings. But I think, you know, the FARC still more or less remains on side with it, doesn't it? Andre, you know better than I do. And I think maybe one way of saying that it's failing is to pile the pressure on. But the problem is, in this global environment, it's really difficult. The perfect storm for peace was the perfect storm when Obama was president, when you had an effective European Union, when you had Santos, for good or bad, as the president. You don't have any of that now. You know, you have Biden, who's barely interested in Latin America, although more so, of course, than Trump was. So whether that piles the pressure on, or whether that simply justifies elites, which they do in Guatemala, turning around and saying, you know, this is all some kind of international global communist conspiracy. The Norwegians are funding the human rights organizations, and, you know, they have to stop it because they're, as they put in a very interesting press communique in 2013, the Norwegians are going to bring recidivism to Guatemala, right? So it's the sovereignty card is often played. Andre, I know you want to stop.
Roddy, no worries. I think, you know, as I said, I mean, if you want to do like a one final wrap-up comment, I mean, we don't, as I said, this is a dialogue, so we don't expect to answer all the questions, but I don't know if there's something else that you just would like to, you know, put a final nail it, and then, or I'm happy also to do the wrapping up now if you prefer me to do it. It's up to you.
Yeah, no, you can go ahead and do it. I mean, I've really enjoyed this. I've learned a lot. It's been a really rich conversation. The questions, Daya and Carl's questions, were really important. The decentralized issue is fundamental, right? And in a way, that's my tendency, is to go towards the decentralization. But in a way, again, decentralization, particularly in countries like Colombia, can have really negative effects, because it allows actors to take advantage. Abby Steele's work on this is really good, right? How decentralization and local government actually worsened the situation in terms of violence and so forth in some cases. So that decentralized structure always, I think, needs to be locked in. And, you know, maybe I'm just becoming a state fetishist. I didn't think I was. I thought I was more of an anarchist. But that's a good place for me to be quiet, I think.
Fantastic, Roddy. No, thank you. I mean, I really want to thank you, because thanks to your suggestive title of Faith Reconciliation, we have gathered an incredible number of people here in this Zoom room. You know, you have offered a lot of food for thought, and so many of the people sitting here who have decided to open up their microphones and turn on their cameras and share their thoughts and their questions have contributed to this so much, which takes me to say that I'm gonna go away with sort of two ideas, and I wanna sort of make two invitations. So the two ideas that I'm gonna go home with is that, and probably the idea is, one of those ideas is a suggestion for you. I don't know. I mean, the idea is that probably we should start working on a concept that is called mainly messy reconciliation, because it seems to me that it's messy, and it's fine that it's messy. I mean, you know, why this idea that we can project manage reconciliation? I mean, you know, probably if we just call it messy reconciliation, and we will be able to see connections that otherwise we wouldn't see, and then we will be able to spread it in a way that allows to fight, you know, to dismantle that system of violence that is so concerning, and that you are absolutely right in the way how you have been putting it about. So probably we should move away from this idea of order, project management, of how we actually do these things step by step, and we just look at messy reconciliation. What can we find there? What are the new questions that we can find and the new inspiration that we can get out of this? So that's like the first thing that I want to say that is been coming to my mind as I've been listening to all of you talking about this, and there are different components. They're just restorative justice, or, there are different things there. Then the second sort of thing that I'm gonna go with, and this is thinking mainly about Maria Lucia's comment and this importance of, dialogue fatigue and all of this, is that actually seeing Oliver Ramsbotham here, what I wanna say is that I keep thinking about this idea of an agonistic dialogue. And I think this idea of, what we need to get through is through the fatigue of dialogue, because probably that's just one of the steps into getting to the very deep, meaningful dialogues that we need to have. And so dialogue is not a process that can also always be assessed and say, and to put qualities on it. It's very uneven. It goes in different moments of intensity. Now, if we think about this agonistic dialogue as a process in which, we finally get people like, in the case of Colombia, if we were managed to engage someone like Uribe in an encounter with someone like, Timochenko, that could be so important. And I just think that, getting to those, to the core of it is just something that a society needs to pave the way for that, and probably doesn't take place in a day, in a year, in 2 years, but it might happen. In this moment, we're seeing an incredible agonistic, probably it's not agonistic dialogue anymore, but we're seeing a dialogue between Timochenko and Mancuso, the former commander of the FARC, the former commander of the IUC, and in the middle of that, Padre Francisco de Rux. Unbelievable. And which takes me to the 2 invitations that I wanted to make. Like the first one, it's an invitation for you all of you, to continue engaging in this critical dialogue series, because this is just the beginning. Roddy has kicked us off, but next month, I think I'm waiting for confirmation, but next month, probably on the 27th of April, we will have Berta Lucia Fries from Colombia talking about reconciliation through values, her own approach to how she has been doing this, that has been doing. And probably she can help us with that. So if you tune into these critical dialogues, we might be able to find something meaningful out of this mess, which is really good. And then the second invitation that I wanted to make is that I think there is a need to think about reconciliation also in a different way in the digital age. And I think that's important, because we need to consider, and I think Roddy is really, paying attention to something quite important, but I want to call the attention to everyone that, in the digital age, the echo chambers, the bots, they are becoming a new obstacle for reconciliation. Is it making it even more difficult to either, try to do national process of reconciliation? And what we need to do probably is to find channels to bring new audiences, to talk about this, to get inspiration about this. Because if there is something really important that Roddy was mentioning in this evening, at least for me, was when he talked about the innovation that in the Colombian peace process, the negotiation parties did when they brought the 60 victims to Havana to talk in the middle of the peace process, because that was an inspiration to other victims to start doing this. And so many of these people who had never had the chance to meet with these others are today doing spaces of resignifying reconciliation for them. So I think people like us who are interested in reconciliation should think about ways of inspiring others who have probably never thought about it. And these spaces are for doing so. So with that in mind, I would like to ask you all if you wish to turn on your cameras and to switch on or unmute your microphones and to offer a round of applause first to Roddy and also to all of you to have come this evening to join us at this event with the Winchester Center for Religion, Reconciliation and Peace and Rodemos el Diálogo, because it has been a transformative moment for us all. So Roddy, thank you very much.
Thank you, Roddy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roddy.
Gracias,
See
María.
you.
Roddy from
Thank you.
Oxford.
Gracias.
Gracias por el espacio, muy bueno.
Bye-bye. See you next time.
Yeah, see you soon. Thank you.
Everybody, thank you.
Charlie.